And the last thing we want to talk about, actually, is exposure. So exposure is interesting. It's a different kind of idea than simplifying values and edges. I'd say simplifying values and edging, like paying attention to edges, is really a way of looking at what you see, processing it, and thinking about diagnosing really what you're seeing. Exposure is almost something that your mind has to really process what you're seeing. So I guess what I'm saying is that it's really you thinking while you're painting, looking out at your painting, processing that information and putting it through your brain, which is like the computer almost. Exposure is difficult to me. It was a difficult idea to learn just because you don't walk around with a camera. Like a camera is probably one of the easier ways to think about it, of exposing for shadow or for light.
Yeah, the camera lens can only capture a much narrower range of a spectrum out there compared to human eyes. So camera exaggerates the limited range, and you must have had experience where you took a picture, of a people against the light source, against the sun, and then the people's faces just go completely dark because the camera can't capture both light and dark together. But in fact, it actually does happen to human eyes. It's just not as extreme. Human can, expose little more wider range of exposures, right? But still, like if you imagine you're in a dark tunnel the whole time, and as you go outside and it's much brighter than it is, like it takes a little bit for your eyes to adjust, and then you can see things better. But if you come out of a dark environment into a bright environment, you must have experienced where it's too bright to even look at, and then slowly your eyes adjust. And again, your eyes do still, control the amount of light that comes into your eye, and that's exposure.
Yeah, one of the dangers about not thinking about exposure is oftentimes when you're looking at something, you're studying. For instance, if we were to paint this scene, you're really studying the trees. So you try to look at the little relationships within a tree, and you're painting that. And then you're looking at the pig independent from the trees that are outside, and you paint the kind of relationships you see within that. And this is really just taking the two images, one that was exposed for light and one that was exposed for shadow, and comping them together in this very kind of rudimentary image. But a lot of times, I'd say, my paintings sometimes end up like this because I don't think about exposure. And this image, I'd say overall, what the result is oftentimes is an image that doesn't necessarily feel lit. The reality of the closest that I feel like we've seen is neither the exposed nor the exposed for light or the shadow, but it's actually kind of an adjustment of both. This is probably the closest of what I actually saw when we took this photograph. But this really is taking exposure into mind. In other words, if I look at just the trees, this is not specifically what I'm seeing. And if I look at just the sculpture, this is not exactly what I'm seeing. But if I squint at the overall image, this is the impression I get. And I'd say that this one probably feels the most appropriately lit.
Yeah, that's again, we talked about that in the first video, that photography can only capture things that photography can do. With human eyes can capture a lot more. So it's actually not a bad exercise, right? To even take your photograph and sort of manipulate it just to match what you are seeing, But like Robert said, if your sort of exposure is everywhere, your painting will definitely look like there's no focus. And this is what we really want to stress in this section of the lesson. Yeah, so it's a painting from a Toy Story 3 that I did, one of the lighting key studies. But again, you can see I'm exposing to on the shadow side, and the bright lit part is completely overexposed, so the bright white almost, because that's not where I want people to look at. I want to make sure people look at characters' eyes, even though their faces are in shadow.
And what's great about this a lot of times too is because you're looking specifically into the shadow and it's overexposed, there's almost like a graphic simplification of the light. So if you look at the light hitting, and this isn't always true, but oftentimes I think it helps to simplify the image overall.
Yeah, I like, in a way, I think both Robert and I love playing with that sort of exaggerated exposure. So we talked about simple value structure earlier, and you can really manipulate that using exposure. Yeah, here, the same thing, I intentionally didn't expose too much onto the shadow side because I wanted to keep Lotso's face mysterious. You can't really see so well. But the same thing, you're still overexposing where the light is, and so you can see just enough on the shadow side.
Yeah, and exposure is such a camera term, but here, if we look at Arthur Melville's paintings, he did watercolors. You could see that he's actually playing with the same idea. He's exposing for the sky. It drops the landscape into these kind of dark, abstract shapes. He's losing edges. Overall, the landscape, which is pretty complicated landscape, I can tell that he's probably looking at, simplifies into kind of a dark shape. And in the same way, looking at this painting, you can see here, he's really exposing for the shadow side here, and the lights just simplify into simple one color, one value almost all throughout. And you can see he's really focused his attention in the shadows.
And this is definitely the choice that he made to kind of create this pattern-like simple value structure. It's his artistic choice. So imagine when you're looking at sunny sort of a village scenery like this, you can easily focus on the pictures on the ground. I'm sure he saw it, but he made his artistic decision, to drop that, to overexpose, and then his focus was on the shadow side.
Yeah, so overall, as we move into we're going to move into a demo for you guys, 2 demos, but overall, I'd say really focus on simplifying values, seeing a 3-value structure, a dark, a middle, and a bright. Also, pay attention to edges. What's a soft edge? What's a hard edge? And how is it affecting how you're seeing value? And then at the end, I think, not necessarily in terms of order or process when you are making a painting, but think about exposure. Think about if you're looking into the light or looking into the shadow side of things, and simplifying one versus the other, picking one versus the other, and ask yourself how that would affect your image. Hey everybody, so every week we're going to try to share a Photoshop tip with you. And some of the stuff I'm sure a lot of you know about and may even know more. Please let us know if there's things you can add to our Photoshop tips. But every week we'll try and share a tip with you. This week we wanted to share layer clipping, or ways of kind of preserving the transparency of a layer. And the reason why we wanted to show you this is you'll probably see this quite a bit in our videos. But it's basically to kind of maintain a shape. So let's say if I create a shape like this, just wanting to maintain this shape and paint freely within it. So if I fill a shape like this, and so one of the ways that we preserve transparency is actually this checkerboard button in your layer palette. You'll see next to the word lock. If you click that, a little lock shows up on the layer. And what that basically does is it preserves the transparency so that I can kind of paint freely within that shape and not worry about losing that exterior edge that is right all around. So that's really one nice way of doing it. Another way that we might preserve transparency is actually sometimes we want a little more flexibility and we're not completely sure of the commitments we want to make. So sometimes if you click on a new layer and you hold down the option button, and if you straddle that line between the 2 layers, you'll see this little box with an arrow shows up. If you click that, it kind of almost attaches that layer to the layer below. And that's also another way to preserve transparency. So if you kind of watch this, I can paint within that layer and it will kind of preserve what's there. So if I go back, hold down the Option key on a Mac, I'm not sure what the PC equivalent is, but if you hold down the Option key, this little icon shows up, and you can see that actual paint layer is actually doing more than what you see. And then if you group it, and the nice thing is sometimes if a pattern's landing in a place you don't like, you can kind of move it around a little bit or transform it without affecting that layer. Also, if you hold down Option and click on a new layer, you can also do it the same thing by clicking this box, use previous layer to create clipping mask, and it'll use that previous layer. So that is a really nice thing also to use to preserve the transparency of that layer. Another way to affect the overall mask, let's say I have something like this, but I wanted, this edge here I'm feeling like is not quite what I want. I can also refine this by creating a layer mask. So if you see this little button at the bottom of your layer palette that has a gray box with a gray circle in it, dark gray circle in it, it creates this mask, and this mask is in all white and black. It's all in black and white layer, white being kind of transparent or completely opaque, and black being transparent. So what that means is that as I paint this layer black or white, so let me just show you for example, if I create like this heart shape in the middle of it and fill it with black of this layer, if I go back to the image, you'll see that that little guy is creating a transparent layer, or transparency in that layer. So go ahead and fill that layer with white. But the nice thing is I could, if I paint with black, so if I switch over to black here, painting in that layer mask, I can start to affect this edge a bit and refine it a bit more using just that layer mask. And right now, if I click all this stuff, get all this stuff and move it around, you can see they all kind of move together. And you can see here, watch the layer mask that moves with it. If I click this little link off here, and I select just, for instance, this mask, you can see I can adjust that layer mask independent from the painting so that it slides separate from it. Okay? So that's the tip this week, is kind of layer transparency and how to kind of preserve some of these edges. It's most useful, I feel like, in preserving edges and preserving shapes. As you get a more complicated painting, it's really nice to be able to have the control over these shapes. All right? Great. We'll move on with our demo.